I'm here from VoltDB. I'm going to talk about one of our customers and how we've been successful with them. So starting off, one slide, what is VoltDB? We're a shared nothing distributed database, stateful SQL relational data store, very, very high performance, focused on high performance, very easy to install, runs anywhere. You can run Linux. And because of it integrated processing component, we sort of sit at the nexus of stream processing and ACID transactional state. A very operational focused, mixing processing and traditional ACID compliant database. So I'm going to talk about one of our customers, Max CDN, and what they do. They're one of the top content delivery networks in the world. So what a content delivery network does, which most people are familiar with, but they move your bits closer to people who want them. So these are Max CDN's points of presence all over the world. And their business model is they charge you when somebody gets your bits from one of their computers. So one note, one more thing about Max CDN, they donate a lot of their bandwidth to open source projects. So if you've used Bootstrap as part of half the internet, then that's one of the things in jQuery. They're the default CDN for those projects, so you've probably used Max CDN. And a note about CDNs in general, there are a lot of CDNs. Max CDN is like top 5. One of them, if you've heard of like Akamai and some of these others, and certainly Google and Amazon. They all do similar things. What they do is, for the most part, a commodity thing where you're picking based on price. So what this means is that the margins are very, very thin. And that's important. So what is their problem? They're very successful. As I said again, they're one of the top CDNs in the world. Their peak traffic is over 300,000 server log updates per second that they want to process. Their goal is to compute live updating billing for their customers, so their customers can have an understanding of what costs they're incurring in real time as much as possible. And they also have secondary goals of monitoring system health and all the other things you do when you're running a big data enterprise. One of the things about each of these 300,000 server log messages may update several counters and aggregations. So starting off, we've got millions of updates to state. Is this just a scale problem? How is this different than a lot of other big data problems? Well, one thing that a lot of people are familiar with is that systems at this scale, the millions of updates per second, when something goes wrong, a lot of times data accuracy suffers, especially when you're trying to do data accuracy in real time. So why? A lot of times there's upstream problems. So when data upstream has some kind of failure, maybe a server generating the logs goes down for a while, or a network between the server generating the logs and your processing system is unavailable briefly, a lot of times you're forced to choose, do you drop that data or do you possibly send data that you've seen before to your processing center? You've got to choose in the sort of streaming terminology, at most once or at least once data. Exactly once is very hard to do here upstream. You also have local failures to worry about. Say you're processing a log message and that updates 4 or 5 counters. If it fails in the middle of updating that log message, do you know how many of those 4 or 5 you've updated? Have you updated 3 of them and then it failed or not? This is actually a very hard thing to say because you can log into the system after it recovers and say, well, what's the value of the counter? Oh, it's 37. What does that mean? Did I update it or not? Unless I work backwards from the beginning of the time, I don't know if that's been updated or not. So it's very difficult to get that right. And one of the ways this manifests itself for Max CDN is the last dollar problem. So the system shows there's some particular stat for how many objects the customer pulled and how many gigabytes. But due to some failures, we're unsure if we process 3% of the logs. So we can leave it alone and possibly undercount by 3%. We can process them again. Maybe we have, maybe we haven't. Then we could possibly overcount by 3%. Do I send them a bill for $97? 97% of their bill? Or do I send them 100%, 103%? I'm somewhere in this range. I have to choose usually between overbilling and underbilling. And this is not something I'm comfortable with. Almost everyone we've talked to chooses underbilling in this scenario. Not everyone, but almost everyone. Max CDN chose underbilling. They're leaving money on the table because they can't guarantee that everything is perfect. So they're looking into how do they make these counters more robust. You can carefully track updates to each counter with a UUID per increment. So if you have atomic read then write key updates, or you have compare and set key updates, you can change your counter schema from counter ID counter value, and you can add a set of UUIDs. So when you're updating the counter, you check if the UUID for that update, that the log message you're processing is already in the set. If not, increment the value and simultaneously add the UUID. If you've already processed this, if the UUID is there, do nothing. And after some time, you clean up the old UUIDs. This is kind of gross, but this is one of the most common ways to deal with this problem. So why is this a terrible option? Well, they looked at Storm. They looked at Spark streaming. They ended up trying to prototype this with Storm. They looked at HBase and Cassandra for state. These are really common choices when you're looking at a Lambda architecture. They ended up looking at HBase primarily because it had stronger consistency than Cassandra in a lot of cases. But none of this mattered. There are a lot of other options besides this. All of them have sort of the same problems. If checking a UUID is not free, did I already update this before? We have to do this many hundreds of thousands to millions of times per second. This is suddenly work I don't have to do when I'm 97 to 103%. But if I'm trying to get to 100%, I have a tremendous amount of extra work. If I have to store UUIDs for every update, suddenly I'm using a lot of extra memory, a lot of extra disk space to store this data. This is not free. The net is that it's possible to do this kind of thing, but it wasn't in Max CDN's budget. Max CDN looked at this and they said, this is not more effective for us than losing 3% or 1% or whatever it is they were losing, because the margins are so thin. So VoltDB came along, and we have two things that Max CDN needed. We have multi-key serializable ACID operation. So this means their operations to VoltDB, they can do updates to many keys that are atomic updates, isolated updates, and durable. We have the best available per dollar spent write throughput available. That means for every dollar you spend on VoltDB, you're going to get higher throughput than anything else I'm aware of. So what they've done is they've sort of created these microbatches, and the microbatches aren't that micro compared to some things, but they take about 70,000 server log lines in a batch. And they send this to stored logic inside VoltDB, and they basically say, I've got a UUID for the whole 70,000 batch. If that UUID is in a set of recent UUIDs, drop it, I've already processed this batch. If the UUID isn't there, process the whole batch and store the UUID. So because this is transactional, I never have to worry about, oh, I've processed 35,000 log entries, but not all 70. I don't have to worry about that middle state. It's either all or it's nothing, and Volt rolls back everything. I don't have to worry about, for a particular log line, there's 5 counters I have to update. Have I updated 3 of them, or have I updated all 5? These are things that they no longer have to worry about. And so as a result, they get the same exactly once semantics that they wanted. They wanted to process every batch exactly once, but with a tremendous amount less effort. And so the difference here is really staggering. They have 1 environment to manage instead of at least 3. Right? They don't have Zookeeper anymore. They don't have Cassandra, HBase. They don't have Storm, Spark streaming. None of that. For Atomicity, all these systems offer single write Atomicity. VoltDB offers multi-write Atomicity. The unit of Atomicity, single row here, and this is going to be a single partition, which means I can basically scale out across my cluster, and I've got Atomicity at each individual CPU core. And so they looked at per batch, they had about 150,000 key lookups to get this 100% accuracy. For VoltDB, they have 1 lookup per partition. So I said it was 170,000 batch. They're actually splitting that among all the VoltDB servers. There aren't 336 servers. That's how many partitions there are. They're divided among a much smaller number of servers. The transaction ID space requirements per microbatch went from 18 gigabytes to, I don't even know what this is, a much smaller number. So if you look at the difference, there's 446 times fewer operations that we got rid of in order to support accurate counting. There's 1.5 million times less space overhead in order to support accurate counting. And VoltDB is faster per lookup and per operation than Cassandra and HBase dramatically. So MaxCDN basically looked at this. They said, this is the way to go. They have a smaller cluster than they had before they had 100% accuracy. They're actually using less money, and they have better accuracy with VoltDB. So essentially, the conclusion, the takeaways here, if you want to do accounting, strong consistency is important, especially for billing or things where the numbers matter. strong consistency is not always, doesn't just make app development easier, it can make it more efficient. You can get more efficiency with consistency. You don't get necessarily more with eventual consistency in these cases. Also, beyond just consistency or not, efficient architecture matters. For a lot of cases, you say, oh, I can add more servers, look how scalable I am. When margins are thin, ad tech, CDNs, telco, all these things where you have a very small amount of money made per item, the number of servers that you have to run is a huge advantage. Thanks a lot. Some more questions? Or logos of companies. We're doing airbrush tattoos, they wash off.